In today's video, we will be discussing client identification. We will show the correct way to identify a client and why it is important. But first, let's have a look at what could happen if the client isn't properly identified.
Here's your meds. Code blue! Time of death, 2 p.m.
The nurse did not identify me correctly or identify me at all before giving me my medications, which turn out were not for me, and now I am dead. The consequences of taking medications that are not meant for you can range from no issues at all to death. But we don't know what reaction a person will have. It seems like such a silly step, but it is imperative that every single time you enter a patient's room, you correctly identify them, as the consequences can be extreme. Now let's try that again, but the correct way.
Hello, my name's Rainey. I'm going to be your nurse today. So I have some medications for you, but can you tell me your name and date of birth, please?
Brooklyn Womble, June 11th of 99.
Perfect. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and check that with your armband as well as your MAR. All right, that all matches. Now let's review the medications that I have for you.
This time, the nurse used 2 forms of identification: my name and date of birth, and if I wasn't able to state these for the nurse, she could use my armband as an identification tool, and potentially a family member if I could not communicate for myself. Another thing that the nurse did right is that she is taking time to go over the medication and what each does for me, and what I will be receiving. The medication checks allows me to say if I would like to take the medication, but also recognize if I'm allergic to any of them, and we can stop a potentially life-threatening event from happening.
Proper identification reduces the number of errors and less paperwork for me. But in all seriousness, the National Patient Safety Goals by the Joint Commissioner requires that at least 2 forms of identification be used when identifying a patient for each encounter. If I leave the room and come back in, it is considered a new encounter. The use of ID bands is considered one of the most important strategies to make sure the patient is identified correctly.
Patient room numbers should never be used as an identifier because patients can be moved from room to room. In the home care setting, patient identification errors are less likely to occur. A patient's confirmed address can be used as an identifier when combined with another person-specific identifier.
Newborns are more likely to be misidentified because they can't speak and don't have distinguishing features. Banding newborns, as well as the parents of said newborn, immediately following delivery is best practice, as it helps eliminate any confusion and ensures that if the pair are separated, the correct newborn is brought back to those parents.
Properly identifying patients also includes code status. People should have an armband stating DNR if they do have a DNR. It is also good to check the patient's chart for a code status when you are accepting a patient's assignment.
As we know and have reviewed patient identification that is accurate and correct is important. One of the statistics that we have is that it can cause a financial impact with patient identity issues, which on average healthcare organizations report spending $1.3 million annually on patient identification resolutions. Furthermore, hospitals will face on average $17.4 million per year in loss due to denied insurance claims due to inaccurate patient identification. Another important statistic that we can consider is medication errors, such as the one that occurred in this scenario. And research has found that patient identification errors will account for approximately 70% of adverse patient outcomes. And this is reported by Imprivata.
In our scenario, a patient received medication that was not intended for them or their treatment plan. Because of this medication being administered to the wrong patient, this patient had a deadly outcome. If these medications were checked with a two-factor patient identification, this medication error could have been stopped. If this medication error would have been stopped, the right patient would have gotten the right medication and our patient would have lived. In the event of a medication or care error, these errors should be directly reported to a nursing supervisor, administration, or provider included in this care plan. When these are reported, these reports go towards improving the process and procedures of the care plans. They are not intended to punish the individuals involved, but to teach them a safer and more effective way of giving care and treatment to patients. Next is some information found from the Joint Commissioner website. They read as followed. Additional examples of identifiers may include, but are not limited to, an assigned identification number or a medical record number, telephone number or another person-specific identifier, an electronic identification technology coding such as barcoding or RFID that includes two or more person-specific identifiers. Armbands. An armband in and of itself is not a patient identifier, rather an example of a source where patient information can be located. It is the person-specific information that is known as the identifier, not the medium on which the information resides. The Joint Commissioner does not require the use of armbands. However, when armbands are used as a means of conveying patient or resident identification information, the band must be attached to the patient or resident at all times. Simply placing it on the bedside table or taping it to the bed would not be acceptable. Applicability to nutrition services. At a minimum, the requirement applies whenever the resident or patient requires a special diet or the meal/snack that is being delivered as part of a special diet. To ensure consistency, organizations have found it easier to implement this requirement by applying it to all patients/residents receiving diets or snacks. Containers used for blood and other specimens. The intent of the goal is met when the patient is correctly identified using two identifiers, and the containers are labeled with two identifiers in the presence of the patient. In practice, it is relatively common to label a urine container prior to giving it to the patient for collection, as long as the individual collecting the specimen verifies the identity of the patient using two patient identifiers and then labels the container while in the presence of the patient. Labeled containers, which are not used due to the failure of the patient to provide a urine specimen, must be immediately discarded. The practice of pre-labeling blood tubes prior to seeing the patient and matching them at the time of collection is not acceptable. Use of temporary names. Under some circumstances, a patient's identification may not be able to be verified, and a temporary means of identification may be used. An example of such circumstances may include an injured, unresponsive patient presenting to the emergency department. Although not addressed in the requirements, a temporary name, example of John Doe, and an emergency department number or medical record number may be assigned. These identifiers could be used to identify the patient and match against specimen labels, medication orders, blood products labels, etc. In this process, formal identification of the patient should occur as soon as possible, and once confirmed, their identifying information should be used instead of temporary identification. Ultimately, the organization determines how such scenarios should be managed. Use of an alias to protect anonymity. There are no Joint Commission standards that address this practice. Organizations should evaluate the risk associated with this practice However, if an organization implements the use of an alias, 2 patient identifiers must still be used as defined by this policy.